I'm happy to tag in. You can stand up here and take questions if that would be supported by the group. Good afternoon. Due to all the events at the White House today, the president being out, we'll keep this fairly quick. Also, I flew back in this morning, so bear with me a little bit, but it's great to be back with everybody. After traveling with the U.S. presidential delegation to the Winter Olympics closing ceremonies led by Ivanka Trump, the entire country is very proud of our athletes. Not only did they perform well in their events, they did it with extraordinary class and sportsmanship. On a personal note, it was a real privilege to meet many of our athletes and their families, and they are just as impressive off the field as they are on. In addition to the athletic competition, these Winter Games were also important from a diplomatic perspective. On Friday, the United States announced the largest ever set of new North Korea sanctions. Companies and countries around the world should know that the Trump administration is 100% committed to the permanent denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And we are watching closely who joins us in fully enforcing United States and United Nations sanctions. We will continue to lead a campaign of maximum pressure on the regime. We also believe that there is a brighter path available to North Korea. They have expressed a desire to hold talks, but let us be completely clear. Denuclearization must be the result of any dialogue with North Korea. Until then, the United States and the world must continue to make it known that North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are a dead end. Here at the White House today, the President was pleased to welcome America's governors. The governors participated in breakout sessions on pressing issues facing our states. Perhaps most importantly, the President led a session on safe schools and safe communities. It was a productive dialogue with our state leaders and came on the heels of other listening sessions the President hosted with survivors, students, teachers, family members, and local officials. The President is committed to ensuring the safety of our schools and communities, and he wants to hear ideas from Americans of all backgrounds and beliefs. He believes we must make our schools a much harder target for attackers. We must protect the rights of law-abiding Americans while keeping guns out of the hands of those who pose a danger to themselves and society. And we must create a culture that cherishes life and human dignity, condemning violence rather than glorifying it. The President will not rest until these goals are achieved. Finally, I'm pleased to officially announce the first state visit of the Trump administration. The President and First Lady will welcome President and Mrs. Macron of France to the White House on April 24th. This visit will advance American and French cooperation on economic and global issues and deepen the friendship between the two countries. And with that, I'll take your questions. John.
Sarah, does the President believe that Sheriff Israel of Broward County should step down, and also the Broward County deputy who has been who resigned, Scott Peterson, has come out with a statement saying he believed that he was acting appropriately. He thought the gunfire was coming from outside the school, and that he was taking steps to ensure that he was in a position to be able to respond to this. Can I get your response on both of them?
Sure. The President feels, in terms of his employment, that should be left up to local officials to make that determination. But he has been very clear in his public comments on how he feels about the situation specifically. But that's a decision that should be left up to local officials.
And Sheriff Israel, should he step down?
Again, those are decisions that should be left up to the local communities and the local officials, and not the President. Margaret.
Sarah, can you specify, the President did not mention whether he actually wants the age limit still lifted to 21, something he had previously spoken about. Can you clarify if that's still his position? Will lawmakers be coming to the White House, and did the President mean to say today that he will be asking for a law to be crafted on bump stocks if it doesn't follow through this executive directive he's asked the ATF to craft?
A lot of questions. Let me see if I can answer all of them. I'm sure you'll remind me if I missed something. On bump stocks, the President did sign an executive memo directing the ATF and Department of Justice to work on outlawing bump stocks, so we don't have to wait for a legislative fix. However, if we cannot find an administrative fix, we would support a legislative solution to complete that. On whether or not he's going to be meeting with lawmakers, the President is planning a meeting for Wednesday with bipartisan members of Congress. We'll have further details on that later in the week. to discuss different pieces of legislation and what they can do moving forward. In terms of, I think the last question you had was the age limit. Something's still being discussed, but a final determination and legislative piece has not been determined on that front yet.
Is that why he didn't mention it today, but he had mentioned it in the past? Is he reconsidering how that should be implemented?
In terms of the concept, there's still support for that, but how it would be implemented what that might look like is still very much part of the discussion. Shannon.
Under General Kelly's new policy on security clearances, can you describe how many people today lost their access to classified information today?
As we've said many times before, we're not going to discuss individual clearances. That goes to a broader number or an individual number, so I'm not going to get into that today, just as I haven't in the past.
Were there any administration officials who lost their access?
That would, again, be discussing security clearances, which our policy has always been not to do so I'm not going to change that today. Mara?
Thank you. Does the President believe that background checks should apply to gun shows and internet sales?
The President believes that we should look at strengthening background checks, and we're looking at all of the different ways to do that and haven't made a final determination on what that should look like. I do think that will be certainly a large part of the conversation that takes place later this week when he visits with lawmakers.
Just one more question on guns. The House bill, which he has expressed support for in the past, has a provision that the NRA calls constitutional carry. Basically, it would allow people with a concealed carry permit in one state to carry it to states, even if those other states don't allow concealed carry. Is the President for that?
I know he has been in the past. I haven't talked to him about it recently, so would have to follow up with you. Dave?
Sarah, the President's been getting a lot of pushback during the governor's meetings about his proposal to allow more adults in schools to carry guns. Governor Inslee this morning, for example. Has the White House heard from any jurisdiction, any school board, any state that is actively pursuing this, where they don't already have that authority?
We've definitely heard from individual teachers and school personnel that support it, but look, we're not advocating for the arming of every single teacher in the school. There are teachers and other school personnel who have experienced pre-existing training and the desire to be part of something like this. We're still listening and making and determining the best steps forward, but we think that hardening our schools and protecting our students with trained personnel is a viable path and one that we're very much looking at. But a final determination on what that would look like hasn't been made and will certainly involve state, local, and federal officials all weighing in, which is a lot of what you've seen over the last couple of weeks. We've had a number of different stakeholders involved. I think you've had some voices from the very most conservative to the most liberal side, and we're looking to bring all of those groups together and determine the best path forward to do the very most that we can to make sure we're doing everything under the administration's purview to protect America's kids.
What did the President think of Ivanka's answer to NBC when she said she didn't sound completely sold on the idea either? She said it was something to look at, but she wasn't sure whether it would work.
Look, this is something, like I just said, that is part of the discussion, and that's what we're doing right now. It's what we did last week. It's what the President did this morning, what we're going to continue to do on Wednesday with lawmakers from both sides of the aisle to make that determination. Olivier?
Thanks, Sarah. You mentioned North Korea in your opening remarks. The President today said that Russia is flouting international sanctions on North Korea. Are there going to be any consequences for that? And as you also mentioned the possibility of dialogue, who from the administration would take point on that?
The President would be the lead in taking point on anything that would move forward in terms of whether or not there will be any consequence. I'm not going to weigh in ahead of time, and we certainly have never broadcast what we might do, but it's something the President does take very seriously. Jordan?
Thanks, Sarah. Some conservatives on Capitol Hill want concealed carry reciprocity to be included in a package of gun legislation. Is that something the White House also supports?
Yeah, I just answered this for Mara, but
it wasn't clear to me, which is why I re-asked.
Well, as I said, I know the President's been supportive of it in the past, but I haven't spoken to him about it recently, so I'd have to follow up with you. John?
Thanks a lot, Sarah. It's on North Korea, and welcome back.
Thank you.
Want to get a sense about whether there are any preconditions for talks that would occur between U.S. and North Korean officials.
I mean, as we've said in the past, that any conversation that we have would match the comments that we've been making in public, and anything that would be discussed would have to be solely on the focus of them agreeing to denuclearize the peninsula. That would be the primary factor in whether or not we would have any conversation with them.
The Vice President led the delegation for the opening ceremonies. Ivanka Trump led the delegation for the closing ceremonies. Such high-level administration officials were in South Korea, and there were some North Korean officials that were present. Was it a missed opportunity for both sides to talk to one another during the Olympics?
I don't think so. I think that the message that the United States wanted to deliver was the one of maximum pressure, and we continue to do that. I think you certainly saw that in all of the remarks, both publicly and those that were private, between the U.S. officials and President Moon and his administration, and also through the actions of the Treasury Department with the largest sanctions ever that you saw on Friday. Blake?
Thank you. I want to get back to the 21 age limit for gun ownership. The president was pretty forthright about this in the, in the onset. And now you just said that it is something that is still being discussed. It feels like a little bit of a downgrade. Why the downgrade? And to those who would say, well, he had lunch with the NRA over the weekend, did the NRA get a hold of him?
I don't think it's at all a downgrade. I think we're talking specifically about implementation and what this process would look like, what specific pieces of legislation might look like, and we haven't seen those yet, so it would be premature for us to weigh in. But as I said, the president's still supportive of the concept. Trey?
Thanks, Sarah. Two quick questions for you. You just returned from the region. From the perspective of the administration, have the North Koreans been successful at all in driving a wedge between the South Koreans and the United States?
I don't think so. I think our alliance is as strong as ever. I think you saw that both with the Vice President's visit, and certainly over the last several days there was a great sense of cooperation. And I would say that that alliance is still very much strong. There's no daylight between us and the South Koreans, particularly on what needs to happen moving forward.
And on the Syrian ceasefire, is the president concerned about the continuing violence despite the fact that there's been a ceasefire brokered for the region?
Look, Syria is terrorizing hundreds of thousands of civilians with airstrikes, artillery, rockets, and a looming ground attack. The regime's use of chlorine gas is, as a weapon, only intensifies this. The United States calls for an immediate end to offensive operation and urgent access for humanitarian workers and badly needed humanitarian aid. Francesca.
Thank you, Sarah. I also want to ask about that luncheon with the National Rifle Association that the president revealed today. Could you say whether that was on Saturday or whether it was on Sunday, and why wasn't that on the president's public schedule, given that he's a pretty open supporter of the NRA and he often talks about it?
It was on Sunday. Obviously, the president wasn't trying to keep it under wraps, or he wouldn't have announced it so publicly. It was a productive conversation, and I think everyone is in agreement that things need to be done, and we have to have some changes take place to do what we can to protect America's kids. And members of the NRA want to be part of that discussion. And as we've said, the president is taking information from a number of stakeholders, and to try to pretend like he's being influenced by any one group would be ridiculous, considering the number of individuals he's met with that come from both the far left to the far right, and a lot of those in between. And we're going to continue those conversations and meet with bipartisan lawmakers on Wednesday later this week.
That the launch took place, Sarah, is because yesterday morning the NRA's spokeswoman had said that these are just things that he's discussing right now when it comes to that age limit that Blake was asking about. And it does seem like there was a softening of the stance from the president between what we heard last week and what we're hearing now today. And is it at this point, is the president firmly committed to that if he can see it in a legislative form?
Again, we haven't seen the legislation in form yet, and so we're not going to speak to potential legislation that doesn't exist, that may have a lot of different nuanced language. In concept, the president still supports it, but in terms of legislation, we'd need to see what that looks like before we weigh in further. Hallie, I'm disappointed that Peter didn't make it We were on the same travel schedule. You should give him a hard time for that.
Thank you. I want to follow up to Trey on Syria, but before I do, I want to ask you this because given the guilty plea from Rick Gates on Friday, I'm wondering what it says in your view about the president's judgment that 3 people linked to his campaign have now turned out to be criminals.
Look, I think that those are issues that took place long before they were involved with the president. And anything beyond that, because those are active investigations, I'm not going to go any further than that.
Do you know Gates served on his campaign?
Yeah, but the actions that are under review and under investigation took place prior to him being part of the president's campaign.
Let me ask you about Syria because in, I think it was last summer, Sean Spicer, who was at this podium, issued a statement in which he said if Assad conducts another mass murder attack using chemical weapons, he and his military will pay a heavy price. Given the developments in Syria that we've seen over the last few days, should the Assad regime be on notice? And has President Trump talked with President Putin in recent days about the situation there?
I think that the president put the Assad regime on notice some time ago, and we're continuing to echo that message. When I said that we call for an immediate end to these offensive operations, we mean it. But in terms of any specific action, as we've said before, I'm not going to broadcast what we may or may not do, but I think they should absolutely take it very seriously. Is there a second part of the
Trump
question?
and Putin discussions this
I'm not
weekend
aware of
today?
any conversations. I don't believe anything's taken place over the last couple of days.
Action. What is immediate? What is the timeline for when you need to see something happen in Syria?
As the president said, he's not going to lay out a specific calendar. He thinks that's a big mistake when it comes to putting pressure on and negotiating things, so I'm not going to do that today. Mike?
Two things I'd like to follow up. First, on the question about the background checks. The president has talked about making background checks stronger, but that would suggest that he thinks that an effective background check is a useful tool. So can you say for sure whether he would support what had been talked about as universal background checks in 2013, the idea of expanding the existing background check system to also cover private sales at gun shows and on the internet? Is that something at least that he's open to?
I'm not aware that that's the position that he's in right now. I do know that he supports the Cornyn legislation, and that would be something that the administration could get behind. In terms of other specific pieces of legislation, the Stop Guns Violence Act would be another piece of legislation that the president would specifically support. Any legislation beyond that, we'd have to see what it looks like and review that before we make that determination. I haven't asked him that specifically.
And then just one other thing, the First Lady today, in her remarks, her brief remarks about to the governors, the spouses, I guess, mentioned the young students from Stoneman Douglas who have been advocating over the past couple of weeks, praised them and said their voices need to be heard. Given that the large majority of those students have been expressing views that run counter to the policies of this administration or the things that this administration will support, for example, assault weapons bans, does the president also agree with the First Lady that these are important voices that need to be heard?
Absolutely, and that's the reason that he had a number of them here at the White House just last week, and why we're going to continue having those conversations. That's one piece of the conversation, and it's certainly one that is very important and should be listened to, and that was why that was the very first meeting that the president held on school safety, was hearing from a number of those students. We want to continue that dialogue as well as continue the conversations with state, local, and federal officials. That's why the president had the governors here today, and that's why he's going to have meetings with lawmakers from Congress from both sides of the aisle later this week. We'll take one last question. Jim?
When the president said earlier today that he would have run into the school, was he suggesting that he could have saved the day?
I think he was just stating that as a leader, he would have stepped in and hopefully been able to help, as a number of the individuals that were in the school, the coach and other adults, and even a lot of the students stepped up and helped protect other students. I think the point he was making is that he would have wanted to have played a role in that as well.
Can I just follow up on that? Is he trained in firing a weapon? Is he trained in using a handgun or a firearm of some sort?
I don't think that was the point he was making. He was saying that he would be a leader and would want to take a courageous action. And a lot of the individuals that helped protect others that day weren't carrying firearms, which I think shows that you can be helpful in that process without it.
We're worried that if you have a lot of people inside these schools with weapons, that this could turn into a situation like the Wild West. What would you say to parents out there who are worried about faculty members, coaches, administrators packing heat?
That's why we're having this conversation. There are also a lot of parents, and we heard from one of them whose daughter was tragically murdered last week. One of the parents from Parkland who advocated for personnel having guns. So there's a lot of different people on both sides of this issue. That's why we're continuing to have these discussions, and that's why we've opened most of them up so that you guys can see exactly where a number of these people are and see that there are a lot of voices on both sides, and we're doing everything we can to bring those groups together, to unify the country, and do everything we can to make sure we're taking the biggest and the strongest steps forward in protecting America's kids. I know I said that was the last question, but Jeff, I'll take one last one for you, and then we'll call it a day.
Thanks, Sarah. China has moved to get rid of term limits, which would allow President Xi to stay in office indefinitely. What's the White House's reaction to that?
I believe that's a decision for China to make about what's best for their country. But as you know, the president's talked about term limits in a number of capacities during the campaign, and something that he supports here in the United States. But that's a decision that would be up to China. Thanks so much, guys. Hope you have a great day. Maybe we'll do a little bit longer tomorrow after I get a full night's rest.
Thanks, Gabby Giffords as well. He met with the NRAs and meeting with every town.
Hi there and welcome to the Briefing Room. I'm ABC News Political Director Rick Klein, joined here by Catherine Falders and Johnny Verhoeven. And a lot of gun news at the end of the briefing there. You heard our colleague Jonathan Karl asking, is the president going to have lunch with Gabby Giffords anytime soon? Maybe the folks over at Everytown, the gun advocacy group, the anti-gun advocacy group, because the news today that we learned, the president himself said it, that he had lunch with the NRA over the weekend, as big questions remain about what exactly he's for and how he's looking to push it. A couple of headlines today, the president again saying he's for strengthening background checks, although no word from the White House on what that actually means. He's going to move on bump stocks, we're told, on his own. But the whole idea of age limits seems to have been dropped from presidential rhetoric. We'll see if he's serious about pushing these things, Catherine.
Yeah, the idea of age limits has been dropped. And bump stocks, you mentioned that he was going to move on that. Something that the NRA isn't particularly keen on. You also saw him renew his calls for an increase in mental institutions and arming teachers. Now, you saw this today from him in those meetings. And with the NRA, he says he's not going to be influenced really by any lobbying group. And don't be afraid of the NRA because they'll ultimately agree with my proposals, right? So you do have these things on the table, bump stocks. It obviously raises a question. These were used in the Las Vegas shooting. Why 4 months after? What took so long? And why now when they weren't used in this particular school shooting? So you have that, and obviously the renewed calls for mental institutions and arming teachers. So it's still very much in the listening phase, as the White House has described it, and not so much legislation.
That's exactly what I was going to say. You hear the word conversation, you hear the word dialogue a lot when it comes to this issue, but then when you actually get into specific policy proposals, it seems like the White House kind of wants to be a little squishy on some of these things, not exactly sure how much they want to expand background checks, but you'll see that even on things like bump stocks, that's one thing, but I think you see the mood in the American public is they want significant gun reform. There's a poll over the weekend from CNN that said 70% of Americans support stricter gun laws. So you see there is a lot of movement on this. You've seen some movement from some different Republican governors on this calling for some action. So you definitely see, while the White House is still in the conversation dialogue mode, I think the people are.
One thing that the president isn't squishy on is how he would have reacted. He says he would have run right in there, weapon or not. Mary Bruce, our senior congressional correspondent, joining us now from Capitol Hill. And Mary, I guess we just assume that Congress has cleared the deck and is going to be talking about guns and voting on a bunch of stuff this week, right?
Not so much. I wouldn't hold your breath on that one. Look, the squishier the president is on this, the more he throws out various proposals and doesn't seem to be really backing one clear legislative deal, the harder it is going to be for Republicans here to get anything done. Look, Republican leaders have been notably silent on this issue over the last week while they've been in recess. They're coming back in to session later this afternoon, but there is no way that you are going to see Republicans in Congress get on board with a plan that runs counter to the NRA, that goes against what their constituents may want if the president does not 100% have their backs here. And so when the president goes out there, and while there are a range of options on the table here on Capitol Hill, the president is pushing a range of options as well. Until you see the president really driving this ship, it is really hard to see how you're going to get anything done up here on the Hill. And I just hate to say it, but I mean, they're under tremendous political pressure. Once again, you're seeing these huge calls for some kind of action once again. And once again, it seems that right now, it does not look like Congress is going to do anything.
Yeah, and I think you're right about as long as the president is lunching with the NRA, I think we know where they're going to stand. They talked about support today for the Fix Nix legislation, the John Cornyn bill, but that's a very minor thing. There's one thing I want to discuss because you mentioned the meetings with the governors earlier today. There was a pretty extraordinary moment with the governor of Washington, Jay Inslee, a Democrat, got in the president's face a little bit. Take a look at what that exchange looked like.
Speaking as a grandfather, speaking as the governor of the state of Washington, I have listened to the people who would be affected by that. I have listened to the biology teachers, and they don't want to do that at any percentage. I've listened to the first grade teachers that don't want to be pistol packing first grade teachers. I've listened to law enforcement who have said they don't want to have to train teachers as law enforcement agencies, which takes about 6 months. Now, I just think this is a circumstance where we need to listen, that educators should educate, and they should not be foisted upon this responsibility of packing heat in first grade classes. Now, I understand you have suggested this, and we suggest things, and sometimes then we listen to people about it, and maybe they don't look so good a little later. So I just suggest we need a little less tweeting here, a little more listening, and let's just take that off the table and move forward.
Less tweeting, more listening. What do you think of that, Johnny?
Well,
Your native
as someone
governor.
who is from the state of Washington, I can tell you Jay Inslee is someone who very much has higher political aspirations. He's talked about as someone who could run for president in 2020. And you saw him there taking advantage of this moment and really taking it to the president on this issue of arming some, school personnel, arming some teachers that the president really seems to be returning to on a regular basis as kind of, a potential fix for this situation. But it's an issue where, we saw some Republican governors, Governor Brian Sandoval of Nevada, Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona, over this weekend say even they're uncomfortable with that issue. So it's hard to see the way forward on that.
Yeah. No, I would totally agree with that. And the president, that was quite a pointed comment out
Yeah.
of him.
Yeah.
Less tweeting.
Less
You
tweeting.
can imagine that he did not like that
We'll
one.
see how that goes.
Yeah,
exactly.
His very tight face as all that went down. I want to hit a couple other topics here. The White House was asked for the first time about the guilty plea of Rick Gates, the former deputy campaign manager under Paul Manafort. The presumption now that he's going to be cooperating with authorities. Alex Malin over at the White House. This is another big name, another guilty plea. Now at least 3 top officials who've admitted guilt. They were involved in the campaign. It seems to me like the White House has had to shift their explanations as more dominoes fall in this investigation.
Yeah, now her explanation, Sarah Sanders said today, was that most of what Rick Gates was involved with, what the FBI was essentially investigating him for, was the stuff that happened well before he joined the campaign. So I guess then the question to follow up on that is, what was their vetting like? You had, these questions about Paul Manafort, a lot of questions about his foreign dealings before he even joined as the campaign's chairman. And those were kind of open questions and still really came to light during the campaign. But I think that one thing that she didn't mention is that his guilty plea to the FBI was made after his time on the campaign and after he was a member of the inaugural committee. So his guilty plea last week to lying to the FBI was actually after everything. So found that it's definitely interesting to watch, though. They're shifting explanations here.
And guys, another thing that we didn't hear from the White House today on directly is the issue of Jared Kushner's security clearances. No comment, very direct no comment from Sarah Sanders on this question of security clearances. The deadline that John Kelly said has passed. So if he was on those temporary security clearances, as we've reported, he would no longer be getting that.
Presumably he would no longer have it by Friday, Rick, but that's still the big question. Does he still have something? Is it limited to his portfolio? That's unknown here, really. And now, obviously, the deadline was on Friday, so you think that he doesn't have it, but they're not going to comment on this one. They're not going to bite. Usually what they say is, we're not going to talk about security clearances. So we're not going to hear anything from them on the record about this vis-a-vis Jared's status.
And another quick headline from over the weekend, we learned that the president had a very tense phone call with the president of Mexico, Enrique Peña Nieto, the consequence of which is there is not going to be a visit from the president of Mexico.
Right.
This issue of the wall funding, we're told in this one, the president just brought it up again, even though the Mexican officials have made clear, we're not paying for the wall.
We've come a long way from the president's, or then candidate Trump's trip to Mexico City, where he said he was going to have a great relationship with President Nieto. And it's one of those things where I was at CPAC last week, and during the president's speech, you still hear those chants of build the wall.
Lock her up, too.
Lock her up and build the wall.
Campaign that won't end.
You know, this is something, and the president's maintained the Mexico's going to pay for it, but
But this is such an interesting issue because the funding of the wall, the president keeps saying Mexico will pay for the wall. It will be paid for by Mexico no matter what they say. But at the end of the day, we've kind of seen this evolution from the president himself and inside the administration that really, how are we going to pay for this wall? Actually, we'll pay for it indirectly. You know, we'll pay through different forms of visa fee. It's just totally unclear. So obviously, this was nixed on the wall.
And there's still no wall funding, just like there is no solution for DACA.
Right.
1 week from today is the deadline that President Trump himself has set for the expiration of status for the so-called Dreamers, 800,000 individuals. And we heard from the Supreme Court today they're not going to take up the challenge on this. This is a good news, bad news situation for the White House because on the one hand, they lose the court battle or this round of the court battle. On the other hand, it gives them a little more flexibility because this deadline of March 5th was a little squishy to begin with. But Mary Bruce, because they're not doing guns this week, clearly they're doing DACA, right? Did I get this one right finally?
Rick, you're 0 for 2, my friend. I wish I had some more action to talk about up here, but it really is remarkable when you think about the fact that just a couple of weeks ago, Democrats shut down the government trying to force some kind of action to pass protections for Dreamers, and now 1 week from today, it seems that March 5th deadline is going to likely come and go without any concrete action here on the Hill. Now, you mentioned, of course, the court acting today. That does, in some ways, buy more time in the sense that they now are allowing the lower courts to work through this issue, challenge the president's actions to try and end the DACA program. But bottom line, it just means that you still have nearly 800,000 young people who were brought here as children, undocumented immigrants brought to the U.S. as children, who are still in legal limbo and who, because the Hill is not acting this week, it seems are likely going to stay there for many months.
And big eyes all around on President Trump and what he does next on a whole bunch of issues. Mary Bruce, let's start our whip around with you. What did you learn today? Any big takeaways?
Oh, man, where to start? But you know, I was actually struck by the fact that, you know, the president thinks or was pretty strong on bump stocks. The president saying, look, if Congress doesn't act, I'm going to go ahead and do that on my own. Well, the problem is it doesn't seem the president can actually do that. Experts and lawmakers seem to agree that no matter what the president's intent is, if he wants to ban those bump stocks, he most likely is going to have to actually work with Congress. And also learning that the president seems to think that he would rush into any emergency situation and take care of everything. So, which regardless of whether his background, whether he's fired a firearm in the past, how much of a marksman he is, that he feels confident that he would be able to rise to these challenges.
Yeah, forget having armed teachers. Just have President Trump at every school.
Exactly.
It seems like it takes care of that.
Just clone him.
There you go. All right. Thank you, Mary. Alex Mallon over at the White House. Some final thoughts here on this Monday?
Yeah, I think that one thing that I learned today is just kind of a reiteration that this is a president who was immensely skeptical of executive power during the campaign. When he saw Obama use the pen, he constantly called him out for it. But this is a president who now, after having so much trouble trying to deal with Congress, is saying, if I need to go around you to get something done, I will do that. And that's what he believes he can do on bump stocks. But it looks like he might even run, as Mary mentioned, into a battle in the courts with that. So he might come up short, just as we've seen him in several times that he's been confronted with the limits of the court system. So it's just kind of the easing of his concerns about what exactly executive power is. I think it's been an interesting kind of trend to follow.
Catherine Falders, what do you got today?
I'm going to bounce off the same thing I was going to say. The president thinking that he could rush into the school and save the day. I'm not quite sure how that's going to go over, especially with Sarah Sanders equating that to leadership.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, really they've been talking about this for a week now, and granted these ideas and legislation needs to be formulated, but again, they're still in the listening phase, and it's still not clear what exactly they're going to do.
Johnny?
Yeah. Well, I'm a governor's guy, and I think one of the things that I'm going to keep an eye on is those sort of moderate Republican governors who are talking about this issue. Your Brian Sandovals, your Charlie Bakers, and your John Kasich's, who is kind of wants to clearly be out there as someone who is an independent voice, in the Republican Party if he stays in the Republican Party. But I think there are going to be some really interesting Republican figures to watch as this debate continues.
Yeah, the states may be taking the lead on this. And I'm struck, watching This Week with George Stephanopoulos yesterday, the NRA spokeswoman Dana Lash on, and didn't really seem concerned about the fact that President Trump says that he is ready to take them on issues like age limits and maybe even background checks. Now we're learning why. I mean, just earlier that weekend, to have top NRA officials lunching privately with the president, we know that this president, above most, is influenced by people who are in the room with him that have that conversation. And the president's confidence today that the NRA is going to be on the same side, I think you get a sense of where this is going.
We'll see how that all plays out.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, that does it for this edition of the Briefing Room. Thank you for joining us this Monday. For Catherine Faulders and Johnny Verhoeven, we thank you so much. Don't forget, download that ABC News app, and we will be back here next time with another edition of the Briefing Room.